The stagecoach came down off the ridge road with its rear wheel already burning, orange light licking up through the boot where the strongbox rode, and Jennie Reed was the only person close enough to see it happen. She had been riding fence lines since before dawn, checking the wire along the north pasture where her steers liked to test the posts, and she heard the horses screaming before she saw the smoke. By the time she put her mare into a gallop across the meadow, the coach was already tipping, one wheel gone to a rut, the driver thrown clear and not moving in the wet grass, and the horses dragging the whole burning wreck another 20 yards before the traces snapped and freed them. She did not think about the smoke filling her lungs or the heat washing off the varnished wood. She thought about the door hanging open and the shape slumped half out of it, one boot still caught inside, and she thought, distantly, that a man was about to burn to death 40 feet from her own lined shack, and she was not going to let that happen on her land. Jennie swung down before her horse had fully stopped, looped the reins twice around a fence post out of habit even with the world catching fire in front of her, and ran. The heat hit her first, then the smoke, thick and oily and smelling of pitch and hot iron. She got her hands under the man's arms and pulled, and he was heavier than he looked dead weight, his head lolling against her shoulder, blood dark in his hair above one ear. She planted her boots and hauled, and the fire cracked and popped behind her like something alive and angry that it was losing its meal, and then they were both down in the wet grass 10 feet clear, and she rolled him onto his back and pressed her ear to his chest. He was breathing, ragged but breathing. She looked up in time to see the coach's roof cave inward with a groan of collapsing timber, sparks spiraling up into the gray morning sky, and somewhere far off down the ridge road, she heard hoofbeats retreating, several horses, moving fast and moving away, and she understood then that the fire had not been an accident of a broken axle or a spooked team. Someone had set it, or shot it, or done something to make it burn, and they had ridden off satisfied that the job was finished. It was not finished. The man in the grass had a pulse under her fingers, faint but steady, and Jennie Reed was not in the habit of leaving a job half done. She checked the driver next, out of duty more than hope, and found him gone, his neck broken in the fall, and she said a short prayer over him because that was what you did, and then she went back to the stranger and looked at him properly for the first time. He was maybe 30 years old, leaned through the shoulders in the way of a man who worked outdoors and did not eat regularly enough, with a jaw already darkening with a day's stubble, and hands that, even unconscious, looked more like a horseman's than a gentleman's, calloused across the palm in the particular pattern left by reins rather than rope. His coat was good cloth once, now scorched along one sleeve, and there was a leather satchel still looped crosswise over his chest that he had apparently held onto even as the coach came apart around him. She got him up over her shoulder and across her mare's back, and she led the horse home at a walk because a run would do a wounded man no good, and the whole way she kept glancing at the ridge road behind her, half expecting the riders to come back and finish what the fire had started. They did not come back, but she felt watched the whole way, and she did not like the feeling one bit. The ranch house sat in a low bend of the valley where the Kettle River slowed and widened before its final run down toward the ferry crossing at Alder Fork, 4 miles further on. Jennie's father had built it 15 years before, a solid 2-story clapboard house with a wraparound porch he had been too proud of and not proud enough of the barn behind it, which Jennie had since made twice the size it used to be. She got the stranger down off the horse with more grunting than she would have liked to admit and laid him out on the daybed in the front room, and then she set about doing what needed doing, because panic solved nothing and there was a man's life in the balance. She cleaned the wound above his ear, which was ugly but shallow, more scalp than skull, the kind of cut that bled a frightening amount and meant very little once it stopped. She checked his ribs for breaks and found none, though there would be bruising for a week. She noted the burn on his forearm, 1st degree only, already blistering at the edge, and she wrapped it in a strip of clean linen soaked in cold well water. Through all of it, he did not wake, And through all of it, he kept one hand curled loosely around the strap of that leather satchel, as though even senseless some part of him refused to let it go. She was tempted, God knew she was tempted, to open it and see what a stranger considered worth dying for. But it was not hers to open, and Jennie Reed had been raised better than that, whatever else the last few years had worn away from her. He woke a little past noon, with the gray light coming soft through the front windows and rain beginning to tick against the glass, early summer rain that would not last the day, but would turn the ridge road to mud by evening. She was in the kitchen doorway when she heard him stir, and she came in with a coffee pot in one hand out of habit more than hospitality, and found him sitting half up on the daybed, one hand pressed to his bandaged head, blinking around the room like a man trying to remember what world he had woken into. "Easy," she said. "You took a knock and you were near burned alive. You'll want to sit still a spell." His eyes found her, and something in them sharpened despite the pain, a quick and thorough kind of attention that she recognized, because she used it herself when sizing up a horse or a hired hand or a man trying to buy her cattle for less than they were worth. "The coach," he said. His voice was rough but level. "The driver, dead, I'm sorry, broke his neck in the fall near as I could tell." He absorbed it the way a man absorbs a blow he has been half expecting, a flinch and then a settling. "There were riders, 4, maybe 5. I heard them before I heard the fire." "I heard them leaving," Jennie said. "Didn't see their faces, you?" "No." He looked down at himself, at the satchel still strapped across his chest, and something in his shoulders eased slightly at finding it there. "You pulled me out. Somebody had to. Most people would have ridden the other way. Most people aren't standing in my north pasture when a stage catches fire," she said. "I'm Jennie Reed. This is my land, and that's my daybed you're bleeding on, so I'd take it kindly if you tell me your name before you pass out on me again." A faint, pained smile crossed his mouth, there and gone. "Eli Walker." The name landed in the room like a dropped plate, and though he could not have known it, Jennie's hand tightened hard enough around the coffee pot handle that her knuckles went white. "Walker," she repeated, careful to keep her voice even. "Any relation to Amos Walker?" Ran horses on the old spread-up past Cutter's Bend before it changed hands. Something shuddered behind Eli Walker's eyes, quick as a door closing. "He was my father. Was. He died 2 winters back. Heart gave out on him. I wasn't there." He said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, which was somehow worse than if he had. "I've been away a long while, Miss Reed. I'm only just getting back." Jennie set the coffee pot down on the side table with more care than the moment strictly required, because her hands wanted to do something violent and coffee pots were not meant for that. "Getting back to do what?" she said. It came out harder than she intended. He looked at her steadily, and there was something old and tired in his face, despite the fact that he could not have been more than 30. "To take back what's mine," he said. "The land my father lost." "The land your father lost," Jennie said, "is half of what's kept this valley poor and quarreling for 2 years, Mr. Walker. And I don't imagine you rode a stagecoach 200 miles just to admire the view." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." Rain thickened against the window glass and the fire popped in the hearth, and neither of them said anything further for a long moment, sizing each other up the way 2 wary animals will across a corral fence, each waiting to see which way the other would bolt. Jennie had not meant to tell him about her father. It was not a story she told easily, and certainly not to a stranger she had known for less than half a day, bleeding on her daybed and holding a secret satchel he would not set down even to eat the broth she brought him that evening. But strangers, she had found, sometimes made confession easier, not harder, because there was no history to protect and no shared future yet to complicate. "My father," she said, 3 days later, when Eli Walker was strong enough to sit at her kitchen table instead of lying flat, "played cards with a man named Silas Cutter in the spring of '85. Lost the deed to our east pasture and half our water rights on the river in one night, on a hand he swore up and down he could not have lost honestly. He never touched a deck of cards again in his life. Died the following winter of a lung fever he might have fought off if he hadn't spent that whole year sick with shame and worry over losing land his own father cleared with an axe and a mule. Eli Walker's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. "Sela's cutter," he said. "You know the name." "I know the name the way a burned man knows fire," Eli said, and set the spoon down very carefully, as though his hands had gone unsteady and he did not trust them. "My father lost our horse ranch to Cutter in a card game the same spring, Miss Reed. Same table, if the dates you're giving me are right. I was there. I watched it happen and I could not stop it because I was 19 years old and green as spring grass, and I did not understand until it was already done that the man was cheating us both blind." The kitchen went very quiet. "You're certain?" Jennie said. "I have spent 2 years being certain," Eli said. "I took up cards myself after that, if you want the whole shameful truth of it. Told myself I'd learn every trick Cutter knew and beat him at his own game, win back what he took, clear my father's name before he died. I was good at it, Miss Reed, good enough to make a living at tables from Spokane to Portland. But I never got close enough to Cutter again to make him pay for what he did, and by the time I gave up trying, my father was already gone, and everything I'd won at those tables I'd lost twice over trying to chase that one debt down. I came back with nothing but this satchel and a bad idea about how to fix things." "What's in the satchel?" He looked at her for a long moment, weighing something, and then he unbuckled the strap and drew out a small, worn leather ledger and a deck of playing cards bound with a strip of cloth. "Proof," he said. "That deck is marked, if you know where to look and know what to look for. I lifted it off Cutter's own table 2 years ago, the last time I sat across from him, and I have carried it every mile since, waiting for the day I could put it in front of a judge who wasn't already bought and paid for by the man. This ledger is a copy I made of the debts he holds on half the ranches and homestead claims in this valley, your family's included, all won the same crooked way. Every deed he holds because of a rigged hand of cards, Miss Reed. Yours and mine, and I'd wager half a dozen others besides." Jennie sat very still, staring at the deck and the ledger on her own kitchen table, feeling something shift inside her chest that had been locked tight since the day the men came to read her father's will and inform her, gently but firmly, that the east pasture and half the river rights belonged on paper to Sela's Cutter. "Why haven't you gone to the marshal with this?" she said. Eli's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "Because the marshal in Alder Fork is a man named Otis Grange, and Otis Grange has been dining at Cutter's table twice a month for 3 years, and there is not a claim filed against Cutter in this territory that Grange hasn't quietly buried. I found that out the hard way in Spokane, when I tried to bring this same evidence to a federal marshal there and got told, kindly but firmly, that Washington Territory land disputes were not his jurisdiction, and that I should take it up with the local law. The local law is the problem, Miss Reed. That's why I came back alone, and quiet, on a stagecoach nobody was supposed to know I was riding." "Somebody knew," Jennie said grimly. "Somebody knew well enough to burn that coach down around you." They looked at each other across the table, and for the first time since she had pulled him out of the fire, Jennie Reed saw not a rival for a scrap of contested pasture, but a man who had lost as much to the same thief as she had, and had carried the weight of it just as long, just as alone. "I think," Eli said slowly, "we may have been enemies for the wrong reasons, Miss Reed." "I think you may be right, Mr. Walker," she said. "But knowing that doesn't put my east pasture back in my name, and it doesn't put your father's ranch back in yours, and Cutter's still sitting up at Cutter's Bend with a marshal in his pocket, and I don't imagine he'll hand either of us our land back on account of a stack of old cards." "No," Eli agreed. "He won't, which means we're going to have to take it from him." Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and long gray light was breaking over the timbered ridges to the west, and somewhere down toward the river a ferry bell clanged, calling the evening crossing, ordinary and unhurried, as if nothing in the whole wide valley had just quietly and irrevocably changed. The trouble, as Jennie explained it over the following days, was not simply proving what Cutter had done. It was reaching anyone with the authority to act on the proof before Cutter's men reached them first. The nearest federal land office with any real power to void a fraudulent claim sat in Coldwater Station. The rail junction town 2 full days' travel south along the only road that did not require fording the Kettle at its worst and widest crossing. That road ran directly through Cutter's Bend, past the toll gate Cutter's men had erected 18 months before on land they did not legally own, under an arrangement with Marshal Grange that called it a private crossing fee, and called any refusal to pay a matter for the marshal's office to settle. Every timber wagon, every cattle drive, every family bound for the rail line paid Cutter's toll or turned back. There was no third road. The mountains saw to that, steep and heavily timbered on both flanks of the valley, with the Kettle River running high and cold with snowmelt through the only gap wide enough for wagons. "There's a man in Coldwater Station," Eli said on the fourth evening, while Jennie mended a bridle by lamplight and he sat with his arm still bound but his color much improved. "Used to drive that same stage route. Sam Hollies. He was at Cutter's table the night my father lost the ranch, dealing, though I never proved he was in on the cheat himself. If he'd testify to what he saw, along with this ledger and this deck, a federal judge would have to act. But Hollies is a nervous man and a poor one, and he's been talking about taking the train east out of Coldwater Station the moment he saved enough fare, out of fear of exactly the kind of men who burned that coach." "Then we need to reach him before he runs," Jennie said, "and we need to reach him by a road that Cutter's men control from end to end." "I need to reach him," Eli said. "There's no reason you should risk your neck on my father's quarrel, Miss Reed. You've done more than enough already, pulling me out of a fire and setting my arm and feeding me for a week." Jennie set the bridle down and looked at him with the particular flatness she reserved for men who underestimated her, a look that had served her well with cattle buyers and bank clerks, and once memorably, a territorial land agent who had tried to explain to her that ranching was no business for a woman alone. "Mr. Walker," she said, "that ledger says Cutter holds paper on my east pasture too. This isn't your quarrel I'd be riding into. It's mine as much as yours and has been for 2 years. Besides which, I've got 600 head of cattle that need to reach the rail pens at Coldwater Station inside of 2 weeks, or I lose my buyer to a rancher over in the Yakima country who's been trying to steal my contract since spring. I was going to make that drive with or without you. The only question is whether you're coming along to help me get past that toll gate, or whether I'm going to have to figure out on my own how to talk my way past armed men who have been paid to stop exactly that kind of talking." Eli studied her for a long moment, something like respect kindling behind the wariness in his eyes. "You drive 600 head through Cutter's Bend. I've got no other road to the rail pens, same as everybody else in this valley. I was hoping to make the crossing quiet, pay whatever toll they demand, and get through without trouble, same as I have the last 2 summers. But if you're right that Cutter's men just burned a stagecoach to keep a witness from reaching Coldwater Station, I doubt they'll let 600 head of my cattle and 1-horse trainer with a satchel full of evidence pass through without noticing who's driving them." "No," Eli said, "they won't." "Then it seems," Jennie said, "we'd best drive them together." He held her gaze a moment longer, and something passed between them that was not quite trust yet, but was the beginning of it, the recognition of 2 people who had each been fighting the same battle alone for far too long and had just discovered they did not have to any longer. "All right, Miss Reed," he said. "Together." The cattle drive left the Reed Ranch at first light 6 days later, 640 head moving slow and lowing through the wet grass. 3 hired hands Jennie trusted from long seasons of work riding flank and drag, and Eli Walker up on a rangy dun gelding that had, until 3 days before, been the most unmanageable animal in Jennie's remuda. She had watched him work with that horse the evening after their conversation about the drive, more out of curiosity than any expectation, and what she saw had settled something in her that she had not entirely realized was still unsettled. The dun, a horse named Cole that Jennie had bought cheap from a trader precisely because no one else could get near him without him striking or bolting, had been given up on by every hand on the ranch. Eli had walked into the round pen at dusk with nothing in his hands, no rope, no whip, and simply stood there, still as a fence post, while the horse circled and snorted and threw his head at the far end of the pen. He had not chased the animal, had not cornered him, had not raised his voice above a low murmur that Jennie, watching from the fence rail, could not make out the words of but could hear the rhythm of, patient and unbroken, on, for the better part of an hour until the horse's circling slowed, and his ears came forward instead of flat back. And eventually, astonishingly, he walked up to Eli Walker on his own and put his nose against the man's shoulder. "How'd you do that?" Jennie had asked, when Eli finally climbed the fence rail to sit beside her, sweat damp and quietly pleased with himself in a way he seemed to be trying not to show. "Same way you'd earn the trust of anybody who's been hurt before and expects to be hurt again," Eli said. "You don't chase them, you don't corner them. You let them come to you when they're ready, and you don't move sudden or lie to them about your intentions in the meanwhile, and eventually most creatures figure out you mean them no harm." "Most creatures," Jennie said. "Not all." "No," he agreed, watching Cole graze peacefully a few yards off, tail swishing in the long gold evening light. "Not all. Some have been hurt too many times to ever fully trust again. But most, if you're patient enough and honest enough, they come around." She had not been able to shake the feeling, watching him, that he had not only been talking about the horse. The road out of the Reed ranch climbed steadily through stands of Douglas fir and cedar so tall they turned midday to dusk beneath their canopy, the cattle moving in a long lowing line with dust rising despite the previous week's rain. And by the second afternoon, they reached the first of the mountain fords, a wide, shallow crossing of the Kettle that in most years gave no trouble but ran high and fast now with the last of the snowmelt. Jennie rode point with one of her hands, a broad, quiet young man named Dale Ferris who had worked her father's ranch since before she was born, while Eli rode drag with the second hand, keeping the slower cattle moving and watching, always watching, the timber on either side of the road with the particular alertness of a man who had already survived one ambush and did not intend to be caught flat by a second. It was Eli who saw them first, 3 riders sitting their horses on a low rise above the ford, watching the drive approach with the unhurried confidence of men who knew they held every advantage of ground and numbers. "Cutter's men," he said quietly, reining alongside Jennie as the herd slowed at the water's edge. "I know the one on the gray. Name's Purdy. He was at Cutter's table the night I lost my temper and my last $10 trying to prove the deck was marked. He's mean and he's not overly bright, which in my experience makes him more dangerous, not less." "We pay the toll and we keep moving," Jennie said. "That's what I've always done, and it's always worked." "It worked because you were driving cattle and asking no questions. It may work differently with me riding beside you. Then you drop back and ride with the drag hands and let me handle the toll same as always," Jennie said. "There's no cause for them to look twice at one more cowhand in a crew of 4. Eli's jaw tightened, but he nodded and reined his horse back toward the rear of the herd without argument, and Jennie appreciated that more than she let herself show, because she had known men, plenty of them, who would have argued the point purely for the sake of being the one who decided. Purdy and his 2 companions rode down off the rise as the lead cattle splashed into the ford, and Jennie met them at the water's edge with her rifle resting easy across her saddle bow, not raised, not hidden, simply present, the way she always carried it on this stretch of road. "Miss Reed," Purdy said, touching his hat brim with a courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "Toll's gone up since last you crossed. $2 a head now, on account of the bridge repairs Mr. Cutter's been financing." There was no bridge, and both of them knew it, but Jennie had learned long ago that arguing economics with an armed man on a lonely road accomplished nothing but delay. "That's steep, Purdy, but I'll pay it," she said, and reached into her saddlebag for the strongbox she kept for exactly this purpose, counting out the toll in silver while Purdy's companions sat their horses and watched the herd file past with the bored, proprietary air of men who had done this 100 times before and expected to do it 100 times again. It was nearly finished, the last of the herd splashing across, when Purdy's gaze drifted back down the line and caught, for just a heartbeat too long, on the rider bringing up the drag. "That one's new," he said. "Don't recall him from last season." "New hire," Jennie said, keeping her voice bored, unbothered, the voice of a woman with 600 head of cattle and no patience for idle questions about her hired help. "Lost 2 hands to the gold strike talk up north. Had to fill the gap somehow." Purdy's eyes lingered a moment longer, and Jennie's heart hammered against her ribs, though she kept her face perfectly still. And then the herd's dust and the ordinary chaos of moving cattle swallowed the moment, and Purdy turned back to his companions with a shrug, satisfied, or at least satisfied enough. "Tell Cutter I said good day," Jennie said, and put her heels to her horse, and did not look back to see whether the recognition in Purdy's eyes had truly faded or only gone quiet, waiting. They made camp that night 8 miles past the ford, in a clearing Jennie had used every summer of the drive since she'd taken over the ranch, sheltered from the wind by a stand of cedar, and close enough to a side creek for water without being close enough to the main road to be easily seen. The hands took the first watch in shifts, and the cattle settled into the low, contented murmur of a herd bedded down for the night, and Jennie sat by the small fire with a tin cup of coffee going cold in her hands, watching Eli check the dun's feet by lantern light with the careful, unhurried attention he gave to everything he touched. "Purdy recognized you," she said, when he finally came to sit across the fire from her. "He did," Eli agreed. "I saw it plain as you did." He didn't say anything to Cutter's face. "I'd wager, not with you standing right there and him wanting his toll collected without a fuss. But he'll ride to Cutter's Bend tonight or tomorrow and tell them what he saw, and by the time we reach Coldwater Station, Cutter will know exactly who's traveling with your herd and exactly why. Then we've lost the advantage of surprise." "We never had it," Eli said. "Not really. Cutter's men burned that coach because somebody told them a witness with evidence was on it. That somebody had to know before I ever left Spokane. I've been wondering the whole ride here who that somebody might be." Jennie went very still. "You think somebody in the valley sold you out?" "I think it's likely," Eli said quietly. "I wired ahead to a lawyer in Coldwater Station before I left, telling him what I was carrying and asking him to arrange a meeting with the federal land examiner who visits twice a year. That wire went through the telegraph office in Alder Fork, same office Marshal Grange has an arrangement with, according to what Holly's told me once in a low moment over whiskey, 2 years back. If Grange read that wire or had someone read it for him, Cutter would have known I was coming before I ever set foot on that stagecoach. Then it wasn't only bad luck that put you on a coach that burned." "No," Eli said. "I don't believe in luck that convenient anymore, Miss Reed. Not since Cutter's table taught me the difference between chance and someone else's design." The fire popped, and sparks rose into the dark canopy of cedar overhead, and Jennie found herself studying the planes of his face in the flickering light, the careful stillness he carried even now, exhausted and hunted and still, somehow steady. "Why do you keep calling me Miss Reed?" she said, before she had entirely decided to say it. "We've near burned to death together, mended each other's wounds, and driven 600 head of cattle past armed men side by side. Seems we're past formality." Something shifted in his expression, warm and a little startled, as though she had caught him at something. "Habit, I suppose. My mother raised me to mind my manners around a lady, and old habits die harder than most things." "Jennie," she said. "It's Jennie." "Jennie," he repeated, testing the shape of it, and something in the way he said it made her stomach turn over pleasantly, unfamiliar and not unwelcome. All right, Jenny. And I suppose I'll call you Eli then, since we're dispensing with formality. I'd like that, he said, and the fire caught the small, genuine smile that crossed his face, the first she had seen from him that was not weighted down with guilt or grief or watchfulness, and Jenny found herself smiling back before she had quite decided to allow it. They sat a while longer in companionable quiet, the herd murmuring in the dark, the creek running low and steady nearby, and Jenny thought, not for the first time since pulling him out of the fire, that there was something in Eli Walker's steadiness that made the whole valley feel a little less like a place she had to fight alone. I ask you something, she said finally, and you tell me true whether or not it's a fair question. Ask it. You gambled 2 years of your life away chasing Cutter across 3 territories. You said yourself you got good enough at cards to make a living at it. What made you stop? Eli was quiet for a long moment, poking a stick idly into the coals. I won a hand in Walla Walla, he said, against a rancher who'd bet his whole spring cattle payment on a pair of queens he shouldn't have trusted. Won it fair, mind you. No marked cards, no cheating, just skill and nerve. And I watched that man's face when he realized what he'd lost, and I saw my own father's face in it, the exact same look, the exact same shame, and I understood in that moment that I had become, in some small, ugly way, exactly the kind of man who had ruined my family. I put the deck down that night and never picked one back up, except to carry this marked one as evidence. I decided if I was going to win anything back, I'd win it honest, or not win it at all. And horses, Jenny said, training them, when did that start? After, he said. I needed a living that didn't involve taking anything from anybody who didn't want to give it. Horses don't lie to you and they don't cheat you, not unless a person's taught them to be afraid enough to bite first. Seemed like honest work. Still does. Jenny looked at him across the fire. At the careful, deliberate way he had rebuilt himself out of the wreckage of what gambling and grief had made of him, and felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a very long time, something that was not quite trust and not quite something warmer, but was closer to both than she had expected to find sitting across a campfire from a man she had pulled unconscious out of a burning stagecoach less than 2 weeks before. For what it's worth, she said, I don't believe you're the kind of man who ruins anybody. You didn't know me 2 years ago. I know you now, Jenny said simply and left it there, because it was true and because she was not yet ready to examine what else might be true besides. The rest of the drive to Coldwater Station passed without incident. 3 more days of dust and lowing cattle and long silences that had stopped feeling uncomfortable somewhere around the 2nd night. And on the 4th morning they came down out of the last stand of timber and saw the rail junction spread below them in the river valley, smoke rising from the roundhouse, the long silver ribbon of track running east toward the mountains and west toward the sea, and beyond the stock pens and the depot. A town of perhaps 800 souls, more than twice the size of Alder Fork, with a proper land office and a proper telegraph, and Eli said grimly, a proper federal land examiner who visited. On the schedule his lawyer had promised, which happened by great and terrible luck, to be that very afternoon. They delivered the herd to the stock pens first, because 600 head of cattle waited for no man's evidence, and Jenny negotiated the sale with her buyer, a stout, careful man named Otto Reinhold who had been buying her cattle for 3 years and trusted her word over any contract, and got her price, full and fair, with a bank draft that would keep the ranch solvent through the winter regardless of how the rest of the day unfolded. Only then did they turn their attention to Sam Holly's. They found him, after some asking, in a rented room above the Coldwater Station depot, packing a single battered valise with the hurried, furtive movements of a man who intended to be gone before nightfall. "Mr. Holly's," Eli said from the open doorway, and the man spun around with a stifled yelp, one hand going to a pocket that likely held a pistol before his eyes adjusted and recognition dawned. "Walker," Holly said, sagging against the bed frame. "God almighty, I thought you were dead. Word came through 2 weeks back that the stage you were on burned on the ridge road out past Alder Fork. "It did burn," Eli said. "I very nearly went with it. Miss Reed here pulled me out." Holly's eyes flicked to Jennie, taking her in, the dust of the trail still on her clothes, the rifle she carried without apology, and something in his expression suggested he had heard her name before, in connection with land Cutter claimed to own. "I'm sorry for it," Holly said, "truly, but I can't help you, Walker. I told you that in Spokane, and I'll tell you again now. I've got a train ticket east in my pocket and a new life waiting in Montana where nobody's ever heard of Silas Cutter, and I mean to be on that train within the hour." "Sam," Eli said, and his voice had gone quiet and steady in a way Jennie recognized from the round pen with coal, the same patient, unhurried tone that coaxed frightened creatures forward instead of driving them further away. "I'm not here to force you to do anything. I know what kind of man Cutter is, and I know what he's capable of better than most. But I've got his marked deck and a ledger of every fraudulent claim he's holding across this valley, and without your word that you saw him deal from the bottom of that deck the night my father lost everything, it's my word against a man with a marshal in his pocket. You don't have to testify in court if you're set on running. But if you give me a sworn statement before the land examiner this afternoon, just a signature on a paper, that alone might be enough to open a federal inquiry that Grange can't quietly bury, and then you can get on whatever train you like and go wherever you like, and never have to look at Cutter's face again." Holly stood very still, valise half-packed, and something in his weathered face wavered, torn between fear and the particular, corrosive weight of a guilty conscience carried too long. "He'll know it was me," Holly said. "The minute that inquiry opens, he'll know exactly who talked, and he'll send men after me even in Montana." "Not if the inquiry names half a dozen witnesses instead of one," Jennie said, speaking for the first time, and both men turned to look at her. "My father lost land to Cutter the same way yours did, Mr. Holly's, and I'd wager there's not a rancher in that valley who hasn't heard rumors of the same. If you give your statement alongside the ledger and the marked cards, and I give mine alongside the deed my father lost, it isn't one man's word against Cutter's marshal anymore. It's a pattern too big for any one crooked lawman to bury." Holly's looked between them for a long moment, and something in the set of Jennie's jaw, the steady certainty in her eyes, seemed to settle something in him that Eli's gentler patience had not quite reached. "All right," he said finally, low and rough. "All right, I'll give my statement. But we'd best hurry, because that examiner's train back east leaves at 4 o'clock, and if we miss the appointment window today, he won't be back through this territory for another 6 months, and by then Cutter will have found some other way to bury us all." They reached the land office with barely an hour to spare, and the examiner, a precise, tired man named Cornelius Pratt who had clearly seen every manner of frontier land dispute in his years of service, listened to Eli's account and Holly's shaky but sincere corroboration with the careful attention of a man weighing evidence he had learned, through long experience, not to dismiss out of hand. He examined the marked deck through a small magnifying glass, turning the cards under the lamp on his desk, and nodded slowly at whatever pattern he found scratched into the backs. "This is a common enough trick among card sharps," Pratt said. "A pinprick pattern raised just enough to feel under the thumb, invisible to the eye across a table. If this deck is genuine, and Mr. Holly's statement corroborates it was used the night in question, that alone constitutes strong evidence of fraud in the transaction that produced the deed to the Walker property, and if the ledger is accurate, several others besides." "It's genuine," Eli said. "I've carried it 2 years to be certain of that." "And the ledger," Pratt said, turning its pages with careful fingers, "names the Reed East pasture and water rights among the properties in question." "It does," Jennie said. "My father's name is right there, third from the top." Pratt closed the ledger and looked between them, and something in his tired eyes sharpened with the particular satisfaction of a bureaucrat who has finally been handed a case worth the paperwork. "I cannot void a deed on the spot, Miss Reed, Mr. Walker." That will require a formal hearing, likely in the territorial court at Olympia, and I will need to take this evidence into federal custody to be certain it isn't lost or destroyed before that hearing can be arranged. But I will tell you plainly, based on what I've seen and heard today, that I intend to recommend a full inquiry into every land transaction involving Sela's cutter in this valley over the past 3 years, and I intend to specifically name Marshal Otis Grange's conduct in failing to investigate prior complaints as grounds for his removal from office pending review. Relief washed through Jennie so suddenly her knees felt unsteady, and beside her she felt Eli exhale, long and slow, as though he had been holding that breath for 2 years. "There is one difficulty," Pratt continued, and Jennie's relief tightened back into wariness at his tone. "This evidence must travel with me, under federal seal, on the 4 o'clock train, to be entered properly into the territorial record before anyone with an interest in its destruction has opportunity to interfere. Given what you've told me about the men who burned that stagecoach, I would advise considerable caution between now and departure." Eli and Jennie exchanged a glance, and the same understanding passed between them without need of words. Word of their visit to the land office would already be traveling back toward Alder Fork by whatever means Cutter's people used to watch this town, and there was very little time left before that 4 o'clock train, and every reason to believe Cutter would not simply let his evidence, and his witness, board it unmolested. The Coldwater Station depot at 3:30 that afternoon was as crowded as Jennie had ever seen it. Cattle buyers and timber men and families bound for points east all converging on the platform beneath a sky gone heavy and gray with the promise of mountain rain. The locomotive already hissing steam at the head of 5 passenger cars, and a string of stock cars behind, its bell tolling the 20-minute call. Jennie stood near the ticket window with Hollis close beside her, his valise clutched tight, while Eli remained a few steps off, scanning the crowd with the same careful, unhurried alertness he gave to frightened horses, watching for the particular stillness or wrongness that marked a man with violent intent among a crowd of ordinary travelers. He saw them before Jennie did, 3 riders reining up hard at the edge of the depot yard, dust still rising off their horses from a fast ride, and even at a distance Jennie recognized Purdy's gray among them, and beside him, unmistakable even from here in his good dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, a broad, heavy-set man with a gray-streaked beard who could only be Sela's cutter himself. "He's here," Eli said quietly, appearing suddenly at Jennie's shoulder. "Cutter in person. He must have ridden straight through the night when Purdy's message reached him." "Pratt's already boarding," Jennie said, watching the examiner's dark-suited figure climb the steps of the second passenger car, the locked satchel containing the ledger and the marked deck clutched under one arm. "If we can just hold until that train pulls out, they'll try to stop it," Eli said. "Or stop Hollis before he boards. Cutter can't let that evidence reach Olympia, Jennie. It's the end of everything he's built if it does." Cutter was already moving through the crowd, unhurried, almost pleasant in his bearing. The way a man moves when he is accustomed to people clearing a path for him, whether they wish to or not, Purdy and the third rider flanking him a step behind. "Mr. Hollis," Cutter called out, his voice carrying easy and warm across the platform, the voice of a man greeting an old friend. "I heard you were thinking of a trip east. Seems a shame to leave without settling up that little matter of your wages first. Come now, we can talk it over quiet. No need to trouble these good people with our business." Hollis went pale and still beside Jennie, and she felt the old fear rise in him like heat off a stove, and she understood in that instant that if Cutter got him alone, even for a moment, out of sight of witnesses, Hollis's courage would collapse entirely and the whole case might unravel with it. "Mr. Hollis has already given his statement to the federal land examiner," Jennie said, stepping deliberately between Cutter and Hollis, her voice pitched to carry, drawing the attention of the nearby travelers who had begun, uneasily, to notice that something was happening. "There's nothing left to settle quietly, Mr. Cutter. It's already a matter of federal record." Cutter's eyes found her properly for the first time, and something behind his pleasant, weathered face went cold and calculating. "Miss Reed, I don't believe we've had the pleasure of a proper introduction, though I've held paper on your east pasture some 2 years now." "Not for much longer," Jennie said. "The examiner has your marked deck and the ledger both, Mr. Cutter, and half the valley's testimony behind it once word gets around. There's no putting that back in the box." "Marked deck," Cutter repeated and laughed low and unhurried, though his eyes had not softened at all. "That's quite a story, Miss Reed. I'd be curious to see this evidence you speak of." "You'll see it in Olympia," Eli said, stepping up beside Jennie, "at the hearing same as everyone else." Recognition flickered across Cutter's face, cold and immediate. "Walker, I did wonder when Purdy's message came through whether you'd managed to survive that coach fire after all. Persistent, your family. Your father was the same. Couldn't accept a fair loss when it was handed to him." "It wasn't a fair loss," Eli said, and his voice, though quiet, carried a hard edge Jennie had not heard from him before, the sound of 2 years of grief finally given somewhere to go. "You know it wasn't, Cutter. I watched you deal that hand myself, and I've spent 2 years proving it, and in about 15 minutes that proof is going to be sitting in a federal ledger in Olympia where you can't buy your way out of it." The train's departure bell began to toll, a long, insistent clanging that sent a ripple of movement through the crowd, travelers hurrying toward the cars, and Cutter's composure cracked, just slightly, at the sound of it. "Purdy," he said, low and sharp, and Jennie saw Purdy's hand drift toward his hip, and the third rider shift his weight, and understood in that instant that Cutter meant to finish this here, on a crowded platform, evidence or no evidence, witnesses or no witnesses, because a desperate man cornered by his own crimes rarely thinks clearly about consequence. "Don't," Eli said, and there was something in the flat, level command of his voice, the same steady patience he used on frightened horses, that made even Purdy hesitate, hand still hovering. "There are 200 people on this platform, Cutter. You draw on us here in front of all these witnesses, and you've handed the federal court a murder charge to go with the fraud. That's not a wager any sane man makes." For a long, taut moment nobody moved, the train's whistle screaming its final warning, steam billowing white across the platform, and Jennie's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Cutter's face war between fury and calculation. Then from behind them, a new voice cut through the tension, flat and official and entirely unwelcome to Cutter's cause. "That's enough, Silas." Marshal Otis Grange himself had arrived, apparently drawn by the commotion, and for one terrible instant Jennie feared he had come to finish what Cutter's men had started. But the marshal's eyes were fixed not on Jennie or Eli, but on the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered close enough to hear every word exchanged, several of them. Jennie realized with a jolt of hope prominent townsfolk of Coldwater Station, a banker, a newspaper man with a notebook already out, none of them under Cutter's influence, none of them bound by whatever arrangement kept the Alder Fork law quiet. Grange's jurisdiction did not extend here, and he seemed to understand, watching that crowd, watching that newspaperman's pencil moving fast across his notebook, that whatever happened on this platform in the next 60 seconds would be reported, in detail, in a town where his name held no protective weight at all. "Get on your horse, Silas," Grange said, low and urgent. "This isn't the place." Cutter's jaw worked, fury plain in the tightness of his shoulders, but he was not, whatever else he was, a foolish man, and he seemed to grasp in that moment that a public reckoning on a crowded platform with a newspaperman watching was a far worse outcome than a quiet retreat to fight another day in whatever court eventually convened. "This isn't finished, Walker," Cutter said, low and cold, already turning toward his horse. "No," Eli said, "it isn't. But it's finished the way you wanted it finished, Cutter. That much I promise you." The train's final whistle shrieked, and Holly's, released from the frozen terror that had held him through the entire confrontation, bolted for the passenger car steps and swung aboard just as the conductor called the last boarding. And through the window Jennie saw him find a seat and press his pale face to the glass, watching the platform recede as the train lurched into motion. Cutter and his men rode off in a hard clatter of hooves, west toward the timber road, and presumably, whatever damage control they intended to attempt before the story reached Olympia ahead of them. Grange lingered a moment longer, his eyes moving between Jennie and Eli with an expression that was not quite an apology and not quite a threat, and then he too turned and walked away without another word. The newspaperman approached them before the platform had even fully cleared, notebook still open, asking eager questions about marked cards and stolen deeds and a federal examiner's satchel, and Jennie found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, laughing. Half from relief and half from the sheer absurdity of standing on a rain-swept platform, explaining 2 years of fraud and grief to a stranger with a pencil, while a train carrying their salvation clattered away east toward the mountains. Eli caught her eye across the dispersing crowd, and there was something in his face, exhausted and disbelieving and underneath it unmistakably tender, that made the laughter catch in her throat and turn into something quieter. "We did it," she said. "We did," he agreed, and closed the distance between them, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else at all, simply stood together on the emptying platform in the thin gray drizzle that had finally begun to fall, close enough that Jennie could feel the warmth of him even through the rain. "I owe you my life twice over now," Eli said quietly. "Once from that fire, and once from whatever Cutter would have done to me on this platform if you hadn't stood your ground beside me." "You'd have stood the same for me," Jennie said. "You already have more than once this past 2 weeks." "I'd stand it 100 times more," Eli said, "if it meant you'd trust me the way you trusted me just now, standing between Cutter and Holly's without a second's hesitation." Jennie looked up at him, rain beginning to darken his dark hair, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled, restless, guarded for 2 long years since her father's death, a quiet certainty that the man standing in front of her, the gambler who had lost everything and rebuilt himself into something steadier and truer, was not a man who would ever break the trust she had, almost without meaning to, already given him. "I do trust you, Eli Walker," she said. "God help me, I do." He reached up, slow and careful, the same unhurried patience he gave to frightened horses, and brushed a strand of rain-damp hair back from her face, and Jennie did not pull away. "Then I don't intend to ever give you cause to regret it," he said, and kissed her, gentle and certain, there on the emptying platform with the rain falling soft around them and the last of the train smoke drifting gray against the mountains. And Jennie kissed him back, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever came next, whatever hearings or waiting or hardship lay between this moment and whatever future they built, she wanted to face it standing exactly where she stood now, beside this man. Together, the hearing in Olympia did not come quickly, and Jennie had not expected it would. Territorial justice moved at the pace of paperwork and railroad schedules, and the availability of judges willing to travel, and it was nearly 2 months before word reached the valley that a formal inquiry had been convened, and another 6 weeks after that before the ruling itself came down. In the meantime, life in the valley did not pause to wait politely for federal courts. Jennie's cattle contract with Otto Reinhold secured the ranch through what remained of the summer, and she spent the intervening weeks doing what she had always done, mending fences, moving stock to summer pasture, watching the timber traffic on the road with a wariness that had not entirely faded even after Cutter's retreat from the Coldwater Station platform. Eli stayed on. There was no formal arrangement between them at first, nothing spoken aloud, only the simple accumulating fact of his presence, mending the horse barn's leaning south wall, gentling a pair of green colts Jennie had been putting off training for want of time, sitting across from her at the kitchen table most evenings with a quiet, steady ease that felt, before either of them had quite named it, like something close to a shared life, already forming around the edges of their separate griefs. Word traveled through the valley the way word always did, faster than any official notice, and Jennie found herself fielding questions from neighbors curious about the stranger living at her place, questions she answered plainly and without apology, because she had never much cared what the valley gossips made of her business, and because, increasingly, she found she did not want to hide the truth of what was growing between them even if she had cared. Marshal Grange resigned his post before the federal inquiry's findings were even formally published, slipping quietly out of the territory in early autumn ahead of charges that would certainly have followed him had he stayed, and word came back eventually that he had settled somewhere in California under a name nobody in Alder Fork much cared to learn. Cutter did not run. Whether from pride or stubbornness or simple lack of anywhere better to go, he stayed at Cutter's Bend through the whole slow process of the inquiry, and Jennie saw him only once more in those months, at a distance, riding alone along the Ridge Road with none of his former swagger, a man watching his empire dissolve paper by paper with nothing left to do but wait for the final blow. The final blow came in late September, in the form of a formal ruling from the territorial court, voiding every deed and claim Silas Cutter held on land or water rights obtained through the fraudulent card games documented in Eli's ledger, restoring those properties to their original owners or their heirs, and levying against Cutter's remaining assets a substantial fine, a portion of which, the ruling specified, was to be held by the territory pending distribution as the court saw fit, including compensation to those most directly harmed in bringing the fraud to light. The letter arrived at the Reed Ranch on a crisp October morning, carried up from Alder Fork by the mail rider, and Jennie read it twice through at the kitchen table while Eli watched her face, waiting. "The East pasture's mine again," she said finally, voice a little unsteady. "And the water rights, all of it restored clean, no more claim on Cutter's part at all." "And mine," Eli said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "The old Walker place too, my father's ranch." They sat with that for a long moment, the weight of 2 years lifting between them all at once, and Jennie found her eyes stinging in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "There's more," she said, and read the final paragraph aloud. "The court further orders that the sum of $1,100, representing a portion of the fines levied against Silas Cutter's remaining assets, be awarded jointly to Jennie Reed and Eli Walker in recognition of their material assistance in exposing this fraud, said sum to be claimed at their discretion from the territorial treasury in Olympia." Eli let out a long breath, sitting back in his chair. $1,100. "That's no small sum, Jennie." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." They looked at each other across the table, and something passed between them that needed no words yet, a shared understanding forming even before either of them said it aloud, and Jennie found herself thinking of the old Walker place, standing empty and neglected these 2 years past, its fences down, its barn roof caving, the good grazing land gone to seed for want of anyone to tend it. She thought of the ford at the Kettle River, still dangerous every spring when the snowmelt ran high, the same ford Cutter's toll gate had once controlled, now standing unclaimed and unmanaged, a hazard to every wagon and drive that crossed it. She thought of the schoolhouse in Alder Fork, 1 room for 30 children, the roof patched so many times it barely kept out the rain anymore. "I don't want that money for myself," she said slowly. "I've got my ranch back whole and clear. I don't need Cutter's fine money to make that right." "Neither do I," Eli said, and she saw in his face that he had been turning over the same thought. "I've got my father's land back, and that's worth more to me than any sum of money could be. What Cutter took from us wasn't dollars, Jennie. It was 2 years of grief and shame that dollars can't buy back either way. Then what do we do with it?" Eli was quiet a moment, considering. "That ford on the Kettle needs a proper bridge. Every family in this valley uses that crossing, and every spring somebody near drowns trying to get a wagon across at high water. A bridge built right would serve this whole valley for 50 years, long after Cutter's name is forgotten entirely. And the schoolhouse roof, Jennie said. It's been patched with tar paper 3 winters running. The fairest children come home soaked through half the school year. $1,100 could see both done, Eli said. The bridge and the roof, with maybe enough left over for new books besides. Seems a fitting use for money that came from a man who spent years taking from this valley instead of giving to it. Jennie looked at him across the table, at the quiet certainty in his face, the same steady patience she had watched him offer to a wild-eyed, unmanageable horse on their very first evening together, and felt something warm and full settle in her chest. "I think," she said, "that's exactly what we ought to do." They rode into Alder Fork together 3 weeks later to make the arrangements, the letter of award and their joint decision drawn up properly by the territory's traveling notary, the funds designated for the bridge and the schoolhouse roof through the county commissioners, no portion of it claimed for either of their own accounts, and the town, when word got around, received the news with the particular warmth of a community that had spent 2 long years quietly suffering under Cutter's toll gates and Grange's blind eye, only now beginning to believe that suffering was truly, finally, at an end. It was a bright, cold morning in late October, the maples along the town's single street gone gold and scarlet, when Eli asked Jennie to walk with him down to the old Walker place, the first time either of them had gone there together since the ruling restored it to his name. The house needed work, plenty of it, the porch sagging, the barn roof holed in 2 places, the fences down in long stretches where cattle had pushed through unchecked for 2 years of neglect. But the land itself was good land, rich bottom pasture along the river, the same water and grazing that had made both his father's ranch and Jennie's border property valuable enough for Cutter to covet in the first place, and standing in the overgrown yard with the autumn light slanting gold through the bare-branched cottonwoods, Jennie could see, plainly, the ranch it might become again with patient work. "I mean to rebuild it," Eli said, standing beside her, looking out over the tangled pasture. "Train horses here, the way I always wanted to before everything went wrong. There's good grazing, and it's close enough to your place that I could still lend a hand with your stock when you need it, and far enough that a man could build something of his own instead of simply borrowing a place in somebody else's life." Something in his voice, careful and deliberate, told Jennie he was working his way toward something larger than a discussion of fence lines and barn repairs, and she waited, watching him, her heart beating a little faster than the cool morning air alone accounted for. "I've been turning something over these past weeks," Eli continued, "and I find I haven't got the gambler's nerve left in me to say it lightly, so I'll just say it plain, the way I ought to. I don't want to build this place alone, Jennie. I don't want to build any place alone, not after everything these past months have shown me about what it means to have somebody standing beside you instead of across a table from you. I love you. I've loved you, I think, since that first night you sat across the fire from me and called me by my given name instead of a stranger's title, and every day since has only made that truer, not less." Jennie felt her breath catch, though she had, if she was honest with herself, seen this moment coming for weeks, had felt it building in every quiet evening at her kitchen table, every unhurried hour he spent gentling her green colts, every small, steady kindness he had shown her since the day she pulled him from that burning coach. "I love you too, Eli Walker," she said, and found the words came easier than she had expected, true and simple and entirely without the fear she might once have expected to feel, offering her heart to a man who carried a gambler's history behind him. "You bet everything you had on winning back your father's honor, and you never once asked me to bet anything I wasn't willing to give freely. That's more than I can say for most men I've known in this valley. I'll never break that trust," Eli said, low and fierce and utterly certain. "Whatever else I've lost in my life, Jennie, I swear to you I will never break that. Not the trust you gave me on that first night, Not the trust you've given me every day since. Not the trust I hope you'll go on giving me for the rest of both our lives, if you'll have me." "Is that a proposal, Eli Walker?" Jennie asked, though she already knew the answer. "Or are you simply hedging your bets before you commit to the wager properly?" Something in the old gambler's instinct sparked behind his eyes, warm and a little rueful. "No hedging left in me, Jennie Reed. Not for this. Will you marry me? Build this ranch and mine both into something whole again, side by side, the way we've done everything else since that fire?" "Yes," Jennie said, without a single moment's hesitation, and the word felt like the truest thing she had said in years. "Yes, Eli, I will." He kissed her there in the overgrown yard of his father's ranch, the cottonwood leaves drifting gold around them on the cold, clean air, and Jennie thought, holding him, that this was the whole of what she had wanted without ever quite letting herself name it. Not rescue, not the surrender of anything she had built or fought for on her own, but a partner steady enough to stand beside her through fire and flood, and every hard mile of road between. A man who had lost everything once and had learned, in the losing, exactly how to hold onto what mattered most when he finally found it again. They were married the following spring, in the small white church at Alder Fork, with the newly built bridge over the kettle standing solid and true not half a mile from the ceremony, and the schoolhouse roof, freshly shingled, keeping the valley's children dry through that whole wet season and every one after. Half the valley turned out for the wedding, ranchers and timber men and their families who had all, in one way or another, felt the slow lifting of the weight Cutter's fraud had laid across the whole community, and there was dancing afterward in the churchyard until well past dark, fiddle music and lantern light, and Jennie Reed, now Jennie Walker, laughing in her husband's arms beneath a sky finally, fully clear of the storms that had hung over that valley for far too long. They built their life between the two ranches, the Reed cattle and the Walker horses, Eli's gentle hand with frightened animals and Jennie's fierce, steady judgment guiding both properties into something neither of them could have built alone. And if anyone in Alder Fork ever wondered aloud how a gambler who'd lost everything and a ranch woman who trusted no one had found their way to each other, the answer, plain enough for anyone who had watched them work side by side through that whole long, hard, extraordinary year, was simply this. He had never once, in all the trials that followed that first burning stagecoach, given her any reason to doubt him, and she had never once, having finally chosen to trust him, taken that trust back. It was, in the end, the only wager either of them had ever needed to win.